Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Canada on the world stage for 13 games, 7 in Vancouver, 6 in Toronto, in the biggest World Cup ever. Shared hosting duties with the U.S. and Mexico, and that translated into many firsts. The first Canadian men's win at a World Cup, first advancement to the knockout round for the men's team, and the first knockout round victory for the men's team. By most accounts, a lot of success. But how did the cities do? I'm Kris McCusker, and in this episode of In This Economy, it's a double guest episode. Royce Chwin, President and CEO of Destination Vancouver, and Andrew Weir, President and CEO at Destination Toronto. So first of all, thanks so much to both of you for agreeing to do this at the same time. I assume that you sort of spoke to each other as the process was unfolding?
We attended many meetings together, Andrew and I, and then, off those meetings, we collaborate anyways and share a lot of business intel and ideas about the visitor economy. And of course, World Cup was one of those anchoring, defining moments that brought us together in talking about how we could better do it, best learning, shared learnings, those kinds of things.
It was really a situation where we weren't competing with each other. We both had 6 games in Toronto, there's 7 games in Vancouver, and it was important that we really presented collectively this wonderful Canadian experience and Canadian story as the only 2 Canadian host destinations. But then even beyond the 2 of us, there were 14 other cities, and so Royce and I and our peers from the other 14 cities got together often. Because again, we weren't competing with Kansas City and Philadelphia and Los Angeles and New York and Mexico City on this. We were together as 16 host cities, and there were, let's say, nuances and multiple dimensions to working with FIFA and all of the different considerations that went into hosting, and not just hosting, but also leveraging the moment as destinations for future growth. And I would say we had a very open line of communication between all the 16 cities.
Andrew, the mayor has declared it a success. Would you agree?
I think by any measure, this has been a very successful undertaking for Toronto. And we really need to look at it both in the immediate term and the long term. So in the immediate, we saw significant spending, significant new arrivals to the city, particularly from markets that are strategically important to us, like Germany, and actually quite a lot of American visitors. Even though there were 11 cities in the U.S. hosting the games, we saw a lot of American visitors during this time because they were following their own country. They might have been German Americans or Panamanian Americans, or Senegalese, where their teams were playing in Toronto. So we did see quite a lot of inbound visitation. But then when you look to the long term, it's really about that build of reputation, the build of demand. And particularly, I'll give you an example. We've been working very hard to grow visitation to Toronto from Germany. It's an important inbound market for us. And when we hosted the German national team here, all of Germany was watching Toronto. And they weren't just watching the game, they were seeing all of the images of the march along the waterfront to the stadium and the social feeds that were coming from tens of thousands of German fans that their families at home were seeing. And that is incredibly powerful and helps build long-term interest and awareness and demand for the destination.
And Royce, would you agree with that assessment? Same thing for Vancouver?
Well said, Andrew. I would absolutely agree with that. There's 3 phases to thinking about a World Cup. All of your preparation, the actual World Cup, and then really importantly, avoiding the great sigh. What happens afterwards? And you're planning for that in the pre-planning phase. And so as you look to position, we didn't know which teams we were going to get. So the draw gets done. It's in December. That's just a few months ahead of the game. Now you start to plan out what does that mean in terms of how your city, how your destination shows up. And you've got a number of partners that are working together in order to do that work. And then it's to leverage the media coverage. How does that coverage show up for the teams, with the teams that show up in your destination? And then, as I said, it's avoiding the great sigh afterwards, because the great tragedy here would be to not leverage the international exposure created by how our city showed up, which showed up beautifully well. And so to Andrew's point, we've seen great increases from a number of the countries that came and played in Vancouver, whether or not it was Australia, which is one of our markets, Germany, Switzerland, even Croatia had a pickup, not to mention the Colombians. And so how do you translate that into something afterwards? But that starts in the pre-planning phase and being smart about it and learning from other major events to avoid the dip.
One thing that I found really interesting about the Vancouver as a host city was this pedestrian area that is continuing.
Yeah, it was the Granville Entertainment District fan zone. That big kudos to our partners at Downtown Van, the Business Improvement Association that led that effort. And they activated 5 blocks. Each block had a theme, and it was a phenomenal success and a grounding point, a ground zero, if you will, after every game. And even for broadcast games, it really brought that street to life. So much so that we, as a collective, as a community, supported by the city, wanted to extend the fan zone. It'll shorten up a little bit, but the idea is to keep Granville Street reanimated. We have a Granville Entertainment District transformational plan, so we hope that this will be a real catalyst to speeding up the work to transform Granville Street into that anchoring street once again for Vancouver.
I was really impressed by what Vancouver did with Granville Street. And I think, we talk about the short-term and the long-term benefits. The other side of this is, as a city, we developed and flexed some new muscles that we hadn't fully developed and flexed before. So the way we used public spaces, the way the streets embraced the marches, the fan zones, that some of which were very planned, others that kind of erupted a bit spontaneously. But there's a lot to learn from how we use these public spaces, because people look for gathering points. And one of the things that we've been really drawing attention to through the work we've done outside of FIFA, but on the Destination Master Plan, is a greater focus on pedestrian hubs within the city. We're seeing some this year with the Church Street pilot and others, and those are important as pilots, but they're not the full realization of the idea of pedestrianization and hubs that really create great energy and places that visitors, residents will spend time and consume, and they start over time to become actually demand drivers and symbolic of the destination. So there's work to do there, but we take some inspiration certainly from what Vancouver did so effectively, and then some of the early work that's already being done in Toronto. But all of this, I think, will be, again, part of the legacy when we look back, is that this World Cup opportunity was a bit of a leapfrog moment where we moved faster towards an objective that otherwise would have taken maybe 5 or 10 years to get to. Maybe we'll get there sooner now because of this turbo boost we've had with the World Cup.
Full disclosure, I went to FIFA Fan Fest, the Canada-Switzerland game, and I had never been to the Bentway before. So this was the Bentway / Fort York. I had never seen it as a Torontonian. So this sort of opened a door potentially for me as someone who lives here. This was an opportunity to see this public space.
A lot of Torontonians probably started with the mindset, and we heard this a lot, and Royce and I, we talked about this a lot before. There was a lot of people with the mindset of, well, boy, the World Cup's coming, I need to get out of town. And very quickly that flipped on its head to, I need to be part of this, because people saw the energy, they saw the excitement. This was the same experience with the Pan Am Games. I have no doubt Vancouver had a similar experience with the Olympics a few years earlier. And it's a common perception, but then once you see the images of that energy, people want to be part of it. And so, as you say, Kris, a lot of people then started to come down and discover areas of the city that they thought they were going to avoid, and instead it turned out to be exactly the kind of urban experience they want, exactly why they live in a big city in the first place, because you have access to these kinds of experiences. And I hope that the World Cup has now created a new interest and foundation of people discovering their own city and leaning into some of these moments of energy rather than seeing them as moments to avoid, because they really are wonderful moments of living in the city.
I found, and Royce, maybe you can speak to this, if you weren't in the area where the events were happening, you probably wouldn't know.
To some degree, the event spaces themselves, so whether or not it was the Piedy or Granville Street or some other zones within Vancouver, they were magnets. They were the draw. Or Jackpool Plaza, where we have the TSN broadcast booth. It was an incredible draw, and very, sort of localized. But in a Vancouver case, because we have such a compact downtown, there was nowhere that you could walk where you did not see jerseys or people moving around trying to get to a place. So the animation created, again, by bigger or smaller activations made a lot of difference. And we do have this memory of the 2010 games. And as you said earlier, people, the games, it's going to be a hassle, it's this and that. And then people had FOMO. And that was often referenced. And World Cup reminded people of that. And some people said that they enjoyed the World Cup vibe even more than the Olympics. So what does that say to us? And I want to pick up on something that Andrew said earlier, which is quite right, and that is legacy. And legacy takes all kinds of different forms. And we think part of the legacy here is a reminder to community that if you build it, they will come. But you can't just randomly do this. It has to be intentional. It has to be an investment. You have to convince civic leaders or those with decision rights or policymakers on things like granting applications for putting these events on, that it is a worthy investment because there's a yearning for it. And I think we forgot about that in the previous years. And so this is showing that people are looking for safe, fun, activated public spaces to gather again, because to Andrew's earlier point, these public places are needed.
I think one of the most important points, one of the most important outcomes from all of this is, to Royce's point, is that coming out of this, there is a sentiment throughout Toronto of, that was fun, what's next? How do we, what more can we do? And it frankly could have gone the other way, right? There's a scenario where the traffic planning and mobility planning wasn't well executed. It was, but there's a scenario in which perhaps it wasn't, or that other things went wrong that didn't in reality. But if they had, the sentiment might have been quite different. It might have been, well, like Royce described, the big sigh, like, let's never do that again. But instead, the sentiment is very positive about we are one of the largest cities in North America. We should aspire to big things. And I think the level of ambition reset is very powerful. Now, there's appropriate questions about levels of expenditure and all those kinds of things. And those are appropriate. We should be having those discussions. But we should also aim high. We should have a level of ambition that is appropriate to the scale and size of city and ambition that we have as a city. And so I think this is part of resetting that. And the fact that we're coming out of this collectively asking the question of what's next is incredibly powerful and motivating.
Agreed. You hit it. Ambition. We are always a work in progress. What is that progress? And how do you get all the stakeholders around the table to rally around that? The haters are going to hate. And you cannot allow smaller groups or other folks to sidetrack and assume that a city can only just do one thing. A city has to do multiple things. To Andrew's point, certainly transparency around level investment, ROI, all of those kinds of questions have to be asked so that funds are held accountable. But building ambition and acting on the ambition is important for constant evolution and progress in a city, because at the end of the day, we're all competing for the same things: investment, talent. We want people to move to our cities. We want people to build community. We want to be able to exemplify small business success to others. All cities want this. And so to punch down on cities is completely counterproductive. How do we support? And that's, as Andrew said at the beginning, we don't really compete with each other. It's actually not a good use of time. How do you share the learnings to build our cities? And through these major events, as a great example, what do we learn? What can we share? And how do we do it better next time?
Andrew, you sort of touched on the financial side, and it was expensive to host the games. Do you think combination of hotel and the games were sold out, do those two things financially balance each other out, the cost of the games versus the money brought into the cities?
A city doesn't get into something the scale of the World Cup to have 3 good weeks in June. That's not the yardstick that we should be measuring this by. And look, June is obviously a busy month in Toronto already. We took a big swing here, and so the impacts are measured by more than just the cash register for a 3-week period. That has to be there. Don't get me wrong. That is important. We need the visitors in the hotels. We need those visitors moving around the city, consuming as much of the city as possible. And I'm happy to say that we really saw a lot of that. We saw very strong swing towards a greater international makeup of our visitation for the month of June, and significant spending throughout the city. So that's important. But this was always about something bigger. This was about the benefit in the moment, but also about how it changes us, how it makes the city better for the long run. Part of that is on the infrastructure side. There's a lot of hard legacy, things like the improvements to the stadium. Yes, the temporary stands came off, but there's millions of dollars of improvements to the stadium facility itself, from the scoreboards to the turf to other hospitality zones to sound and other technology that you don't necessarily see, but really takes the stadium up a level in terms of our ability to host future events. But it really does come down to how we parlay this success into future. So, an area that we haven't really talked about yet is attracting future events. And we hosted dozens of meeting planners that are looking at Toronto for future events, whether it's medical conferences or technology. What better way to show them how Toronto delivers a great event than to show them the biggest thing we've ever hosted? So some of the impact of hosting the World Cup will show up in 2 and 5 years from now, when this International Medical Society and that technology conference comes to Toronto, and they choose Toronto and bring their 5,000 or 8,000 delegates to Toronto because they saw how successfully the city managed something the scale of the World Cup, and that gave them confidence to choose the city. So the economic benefits go well beyond the last match, and I think it's really important that we see it through that lens.
Royce, would you have a similar take?
1,000%. We wanted to steer away from a narrative that was being created through many of the cities, that the success of this event was defined by hotel occupancy, and it's not defined by hotel occupancy. And that was the story that often was being looked at. It's much bigger. As Andrew said, this is a big, big swing. What do you do with the time that you had to build business later? We did a lot of key account hosting as well, so we could land business in the following years. And to try to define 25 days of games in Vancouver, 7 games by the level of investment, you're never going to make those numbers work, no matter what you do. It has to be on the long tail. What happens afterwards? Can you see the business impacting in the following years? We know factually that when we held the 2010 games, there was a correlating uptick from 2011 out to 2019 when the pandemic hit, that showed an increase in visitation to Vancouver, an increase in spend, an increase in business events, as an example of conferences being landed into the city. And, as Andrew points out, people come in and experience the city, or they see it. For example, our investment that we had with Science World to turn Science World into a giant Trianda ball with the stadium in the background, it starts with creating that awareness and that interest, and then taking advantage and hooking those people into a Vancouver opportunity, whether it's another festival, whether it's another event, whether it's a business event, whatever it may be. That will be the measure of success in the following years. I would say, finally, though, it's our responsibility as destinations, particularly as destination management organizations, to create, own, and share a narrative preceding the World Cup that shows how we're building on this success, so that we're showing the return on investment, and that it's not just centered on the number of game days that we had in our cities.
Can you talk a little about lessons learned? I mean, Andrew, you sort of touched on this. There is a difference between planning and how things actually play out.
Sure. I mean, look, we are in the destination promotion business, so I'm not going to speak to traffic management and other things that the city led. But as it relates to our business, I'll tell you, one takeaway for me was that the broadcast itself really focuses on the match. It focuses on the pitch, on the players. The broadcast does not show a significant amount of the destination. So the notion that was going to deliver our destination story did not materialize. So what I'm pleased about is the way our team really focused on not relying on the broadcast. And we invited in dozens and dozens of media and other social influencers from all of the markets that we were trying to reach. And that's how the destination story got out, far more than by the broadcast. So that was something I feel we got largely right, but certainly a learning that the broadcast itself, we can't rely on that in this instance. I think different types of events are different. The Olympics has a lot more in-between time where you see more of the destination, but the World Cup really is about the game on the pitch and the players and the coaches and the staff. And so we really focused heavily on making sure the destination message got out through these other means, and that largely proved successful.
And Royce, for Vancouver?
We had the Olympics. We had the 2015 Women's World Cup in Vancouver as well, plus a number of recent smaller events. But Vancouver's flex, its muscle memory on traffic control, security, all of those kinds of things, logistics, was very much there. So we didn't have to work from scratch. We were able to leverage that. But to Andrew's point, we were fortunate to have the TSN broadcast desk. So that was helpful. Again, the Trianda ball, that went viral. It went out there and showed the destination. But I would look at this a little bit differently than a lesson learned. And that is, to be really transparent, the World Cup was positioned and is the biggest sporting event in the world, and it would do this and that and the next thing for the destination. However, there is no precedent for this World Cup. A World Cup has never been held in 3 countries, in 16 cities, across multiple time zones. So what was sold as an incredible event, which it was, I think materialized in very, very different ways for our cities in the actuality because there was no precedent. We know in Vancouver, for example, that there were businesses that did incredible. They created sales records that they've never seen before. We also know there were parts of the city that actually saw decreases during June, that business was displaced because the hotels didn't take any meetings, and it shifted a pattern around. And as a result, other businesses were impacted by this. So the sense that the world was going to descend on your city. Well, the world was picking 16 different cities to descend upon, which did not create that compression that normally comes with the World Cup in a much smaller footprint. The other thing that we note, and I don't know if it was Vancouver, is that the spending habits of the visitors coming in was very different than other kinds of events. Talking to the food wholesalers, double-digit increases in hot dogs, hamburgers, chips, nachos, wings, beer, those kinds of things. And not every restaurant is going to be serving those kinds of things. So we saw a very different spending pattern with visitors and locals alike enjoying World Cup.
So Andrew, in Toronto, final thoughts?
In a lot of respects, this World Cup was the right experience at the right time from a Canadian perspective. This was an opportunity to show what Canada does exceptionally well, particularly now, which is throw its arms open to the world. And I think we saw that in the celebrations on the street. We saw it in the stadium. We saw it the way every team that played in Toronto, and I'm sure it was the same in Vancouver, essentially played a home game. And that's a pretty powerful statement that radiated throughout the world. So in this moment of instability and people questioning where they feel comfortable traveling, from a travel perspective, I think Canada showed up exceptionally well. And essentially, this was a moment where Canada really showed up the way Canada should and does show up. And I think that will have enormous impact over the long term because people know that they feel welcome here.
And Royce, parting thoughts?
I would say that the biggest thing for me, and I really, a huge shout out to Andrew in Toronto because they kicked off World Cup in Canada and really set the bar high. And perhaps the one thing of many things that I would take away is that the World Cup reignited this sense of Canadian and civic pride that maybe had disappeared a little bit in the last few years. And the cities coming together, communities coming together and celebrating together, irrespective of where you are from, really exemplified what makes Canada, Canada. And I'm not trying to give you a motherhood and pie statement here. This is a very divisive world right now. There are a lot of unfortunate things that are being said and things that we're all dealing with. And a World Cup in Canada showed that we can rise above that. We can create things that pull people together, and that city pride and community pride is still something that exists. And we demonstrated that. And I'm super proud of how Toronto and Vancouver showed up, and then Canada showed up to put on the World Cup. And I think we really, in a way, led by example. This is what Canada is about, and we were able to demonstrate and show that to the world.
There wasn't a headline about any places in Canada running out of beer like they had in Boston. So that was a plus, because that was something that sort of reverberated. I guess they had a lot of Scottish fans in Boston, so that created an issue. Well, thank you both so much for doing this. I really appreciate both of you taking the time to talk.
Well, appreciate the chance to talk about it, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
That's Royce Chwin, President and CEO at Destination Vancouver, and Andrew Weir, President and CEO at Destination Toronto. And that wraps up another episode of In This Economy. I'm Kris McCusker. Thanks for listening.